Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Delving into Academics. It's a podcast where various researchers from biology, chemistry and physics tell us a bit about what they're currently researching and their life as an academic. For this episode, Professor Tom Welton from Imperial College London tells us a bit about his work in ionic liquids. So today I am with Professor Tom Welton. He started out doing a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry at the University of Sussex, graduating in 1985. He then continued at the University of Sussex to do a DPhil, which he completed in 1990 under the supervision of Kenneth Seddon. He then went on to Imperial College London as a Lloyd's of London Tertiary Fellow in 1993, then to become a lecturer there in 1995 and a professor there in 2004. During his tenure, he was the Director of Undergraduate Studies and Head of Chemistry from 2007 to 2014. And in January 2015, he was made Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences. Since 2013, he has been a member of the Council of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and in 2017 he obtained an OBE for services to diversity and education. He is currently the President-elect for the Royal Society of Chemistry, and next year will be the President. So thank you so much for being on this podcast.
You're very welcome.
So we'll get started with what you're currently researching.
So my research is on a family of solvents called ionic liquids, and well, in principle they're very simple in that, so if you take table salt, sodium chloride, and heat it up, eventually it melts, and that liquid is composed entirely of ions, and so it is an ionic liquid. 801 degrees isn't a lot of use to anybody. And so what we can do is, by making the ions bigger, making the ions more flexible, more charge dispersed, we can bring the melting point of the salt down until you get something which is still a pure salt, but liquid at room temperature. And then my research is essentially asking, is that interesting? And could it be useful? And it's turned out that the answers to both of those questions are yes, which means that I've been able to work with them, well, since I did my PhD. So my PhD was with ionic liquids. And so in more detail, so I always like to have something about my research which is very applied, and something about my research which is very fundamental. And the work that I'm doing, which is applied at the moment, is to try to find better ways of processing cellulose that it turns out the ionic liquids are helpful with, but not perfect. And so you can't just, take an ionic liquid and simply process the cellulose without any complications. And so you have to think about the reactivity of the ionic liquid with the cellulose itself, the amount of water that's present, the controlled condition, and so that it turns out to be quite a complicated thing. And so we're working on that at the moment. We're working on the more fundamental side with trying to find out what ionic liquids do and how they behave in an electric field. And so there are some things that we know and are now well established, which is, if you have an electrode, say you have a positively charged electrode, then what happens, of course, is the anions of the ionic liquid prefer that, so they sit on top of that in a layer, and then sitting on top of the layer of those anions is now a layer of cations, and so you get this anion-cation layering out to a few molecular depth. widths, maybe at most 5 nanometers or something like that. And these layers get more and more diffuse and eventually go into the bulk. Except what we also know from very careful measurements that other people have done, people like Susan Perkin at Oxford, that there's a zone in between the layered zone and the truly random bulk part. And so they can measure forces, but we don't know how those forces come about. And so on my more fundamental side, I've been looking at that. So what is happening when you have these electric fields? How are the ionic liquids orientating themselves or layering themselves, or whatever it is that they're doing in this intermediate zone? And trying to find that out. And it is certainly interesting. Whether that turns out to be useful, I've got no idea at all. But it is certainly very interesting.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting and quite exciting experiments and areas of research that you're currently trying to develop. So probably let's start with the application side of your research. What are the probably more practical applications of looking at ionic liquids and how they react with cellulose?
So, well, actually there's a patent from the middle of the last century which used a particular ionic liquid to dissolve cellulose. Cellulose is actually quite difficult to dissolve. It is the world's most common polymer. It's what holds trees up, and it's a material that nature has selected, I suppose you would say, in order to be robust, because you can't have your tree dissolving every time it rains. So it's quite difficult to dissolve in the first place, and it's particularly difficult to dissolve in a solvent that doesn't in some way react with it. And so therefore the solvent reacting with it has a possibility of breaking down the fibres. So you want to separate the fibres, but you don't want to shorten the fibres. That's kind of what you're trying to do. And many of the things that you would do to try and dissolve cellulose lead to a shortening of the fibres, not just a separation of the fibres, or they don't separate the fibres. And so you're trying to find this very fine balance of being able to do the one without the other, or without doing the other too much. And that might be by selection of the particular ionic liquid that you're using. That helps. It might be using a co-solvent so that you're, as it were, kind of moderating the intensity of the reaction coming from the ionic liquid. A combination of that. It might be about the conditions that you're using. What temperature can you get the cellulose to dissolve at? Can you get it to dissolve at a temperature which is cool enough that you slow the reaction down enough to allow it to process well enough? Do you then make a solution that is just of the right viscosity that you can spin it into a fibre that you can then weave into a fabric? All of these questions are things that we're playing around with. We will get there, I'm sure. It's one of those things that I'm actually quite confident that we'll get there. There are other groups around the world working on this as well. We're not the only ones. And people are all trying slightly different approaches, because you do. There's no point everybody's trying to do exactly the same thing. And I'm sure one of those approaches will come to fruition. Yeah,
and it sounds like there's quite a lot of questions that you've got going in relation to these reactions. And so how do you design the experiments to find answers to these questions, and what kind of measurements are you making?
Okay, so our early interventions were, I'm considered an expert on the polarity of the ionic liquids. Our initial experiments were about trying to work out what it was about the different polarity of different ionic liquids that led to them being better or worse solvents for the cellulose. And we and others discovered that the big thing was the anion and the associated hydrogen bond basicity that comes with the anion and how that changes, and that you needed a very good hydrogen bonding anion in order to be able to break up the hydrogen bond network in the cellulose, which is what was holding the fibres together. And so we knew that. With the popular cation, which are based on a cyclic compound called an imidazolium ring. Unfortunately, the more basic the anion, the more it promoted a reaction between the cation and the cellulose. And so we and others have been trying to find other cations to see if you can solve problems that way. Then you get into problems of the things like the melting point, the viscosity of the solution, that kind of stuff start to become problematic. And so that's what kind of happens, that you fix one problem, then you discover another. And then, okay, well, let's try and fix that problem. Does that take us back? There are also other things. So the anti-solvent, the thing which makes cellulose come out of solution, is water. And the higher the basicity of the anion, the more it will just absorb the water from the atmosphere. And so then you end up with an ionic liquid water mixture in which the cellulose isn't soluble anymore. And so okay, start again, let's try something else. And you're just constantly going around those cycles, but it's all based around trying to get some kind of understanding of what's happening so you can then make a prediction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like, as you say, your groups are kind of going towards that by kind of trial and error method. And so kind of what have you found so far? Like, what stage, I guess, of that trial and error method are you at?
So with the imidazolium acetate, which is the most popular ionic liquids that get used, we're at the moment, so it was already known that you could add a co-solvent, particularly DMSO. It was the co-solvent that gets used. But unfortunately, DMSO is not what you'd call a very environmentally friendly solvent. And given that the cellulose processes that are out there in industry at the moment have solvents which are not environmentally friendly, and that's part of the purpose of making the change, well, you're not actually helping. So what we've been doing is we've been looking to see if some other more environmentally benign, biomass-derived, recyclable solvents can do the same job that the DMS does, but without being such an environmental hazard in itself. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. And yeah, that seems to be working. Our collaborators at the University of Bristol who make the fibres, they're seeing some quite high quality fibres. So that's a good sign. That's a good sign. I think that what we might end up doing is once we, this is literally where we are. I think what we might end up doing, and so that's the next project, is to take the co-solvents that we've been using with the imidazolium-based ionic liquids and try them with some of the non-imidazolium-based ionic liquids to see whether we can bring some of the advantages of the co-solvents to those, such as lower operating temperatures, less viscous solutions, and see if that helps out.
Yeah, wow. It sounds like, especially with the environmental friendly type of solvents, there is kind of a big point that's on everyone's minds, and I think chemistry can really help with that, especially with these solvents in industry. So kind of what makes DMSO so non-environmentally friendly versus the types of solvents that you're looking at?
Okay, so there's a range of ways in which you can look at the environmental sustainability of different solvents, and there are a whole variety of different ways of doing it, and and people quantify it. People make traffic light systems, people make scoring systems for it. On the whole, they all get based around the same kinds of things. And so toxicity is an important issue. And of course, not just toxicity to us, but toxicity to, microorganisms, plant, that kind of environmental toxicity is an important measure. Persistence. And so some chemicals, it doesn't matter that it's solvents, but some chemicals will persist in the environment for a long time without breaking down into more benign components. And so is it biodegradable? Is it persistent? Is that kind of thing? Availability, so is it volatile? So if it's something that you can breathe in, then you're more likely to be exposed to it than if it's something that's not very volatile and you can't breathe it in because it's not actually in the air. And so the availability, the bioavailability of it, how easily can you get exposed to it? So those kind of things. And then you kind of bring those together, and as I say, there are different ways, different systems load those differently. Oh, flammability, that was the one that doesn't catch fire and burn buildings down. The different techniques used a different weighting for different elements of it, but basically they're all the kinds of things that go into it.
So in choosing your solvent and having to kind of look at these types of things, is there anything else that you maybe consider in a solvent? Maybe how well it can dissolve cellulose?
No. I mean, you say obviously, but that's not so obvious. I mean, yes, you're right, but that's not so obvious. So you have all of the things about what happens if this solvent gets into the environment, but then you've also got the effectiveness of the solvent in the process. And so imagine two hypothetical solvents, and the first one does, it dissolves the cellulose at 200 degrees, I don't know, and out in the environment it's not so bad. And then you've got another one which dissolves the cellulose effectively at 50 degrees. But out in the environment, it's not the worst solvent that there's ever been, but it's not so good. And then you say, right, okay, but now my process uses much more energy if I pick the first solvent. And the environmental impact of the process is now greater, even though the environmental impact of the solvent, when it goes out there, if it spills into the environment, is less. And of course the chemical engineers would immediately say, well, we'll design your process so the solvent doesn't get out into the environment, and so and so it is actually a very complex set of questions, and it turns out not to be obvious at all when you're trying to select which is the solvent I'm actually going to use, because of course most of the time we hope that our process solvents don't get into the environment. So you might only be saying, right, I've got to now calculate on the basis that, how often do I expect there to be a mistake? How often do I expect there to be an accident? How often do I need to take into account that something unexpected will happen in my system in order to be able to balance across the whole piece? And you might end up saying, well, it could be better overall for the sustainability of the process to use the solvent which isn't such an environmentally benign solvent, because its impact on the process is so great, and the environmental impact of the process is so great, that actually the balance of those two things leads me to that solvent rather than the first one. And so really, obvious is the one word it's not.
Yeah, it's quite surprising. There's so many considerations that I probably wouldn't have thought of, especially with temperature and using more energy, and then the environmental impact of that. So it does sound quite complicated, really.
It is, and we as the field didn't think about it. So if you go back to the 1990s, people did just say, this solvent is greener than that solvent, you have to use it because it's better. And it took a while for the field to realise, oh, hang on, it's more complicated than that, and we have to consider all of these other things as well. And ultimately, we also have to consider cost. The simple truth is that not only do you need to generate more environmentally friendly products that people can buy, but you have to produce them at a price that people are willing to pay. And as much as people say, and there is a small element of the population who are willing to, pay a little bit more for a green product, most people aren't. So you then have to also, on top of all of that, make your process financially competitive, because also the company needs to make money. And so for a product to sustain, and that is to be here next year, to sustain, it has to be delivered at a price that we're willing to pay, And that price also has to be a price that the company makes money out of, otherwise we won't buy it and it will go off the shelves, or the company will stop making it and it will go off the shelves. And on top of that, the whole process of getting that product to us has to be more environmentally sustainable than the thing that it's competing with. So it really is extraordinarily complicated.
Yeah, it totally is. And I feel like chemistry, with that whole industrial process side to it, is probably thinking about this quite a lot more than perhaps physics, because I study physics, and to add the complicatedness to all these.
It's a big issue that came around, I guess, from about the 1960s, the idea started to develop that, hang on, we just can't keep doing this. When literally, if you Google, you'll find pictures of rivers on fire, pictures of, foam just going down, it started to dawn on us that we couldn't just carry on like we were. And then that's developed through the idea of green and sustainable chemistry as a subject area now. And of course when it started off it was considered a little bit flaky, whereas now it's very mainstream, and it'll be not only an undergraduate curricula, it'll even be in school curricula.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's quite a good step in the right direction, especially now when we are considering these things and they're a bit more in the public eye. It's good to kind of be thinking about this alongside research. And I kind of wanted to take it back a little to talk about your more fundamental aspect of your research. So kind of what types of experiments are you doing there to look at these electrodes and the kind of anion cation layers in the area?
So most of this work is collaborative, which is part of what I like about it. And so we've got collaborators that we're working with here at Imperial, where we're looking at fluorescent spectroscopy, which is, we can use the spectroscopy to inform us about the viscosity around a molecule. So not the viscosity as if I'm stirring a spoon, but if I'm a molecule that's got a little rotating bit, what's the viscosity that I'm experiencing doing that, which can be quite different to the viscosity if I'm stirring with a spoon. And trying to understand how that changes as the electric field goes on and the electric field goes off, and how that changes at various depths from the electrode surface. Also, I mentioned Susan Perkin earlier on. She uses a technique which brings two surfaces together and squeezes down on the ionic liquid, or indeed any other liquid she can look at. And so she can measure the layering by the change in the force that's required to squeeze down. So we do that. We've been doing that with her. We've also been working with our colleagues both here, so Tricia Hunt here, who's a quantum mechanics theoretician, and Barbara Kirkner at the University of Bonn, who is a molecular dynamics theoretician, to try and model what might be happening. And it's kind of interesting. So what we can't do is model the experiment directly. You can't do that. The time scales, the length scales would mean that you'd need to use the world's entire computing power for God knows how long to be able to model it, and you say you can't do that. So what we try to do is we try to get inspiration from the modelling to help us think about what's happening in the experiments. So one of the things that we're working on at the moment is, it's a lot easier to rotate a molecule than it is to translate it. To move it through space takes more energy than it does to spin it round where it is. And so therefore you can ask the question, and we are seeing it in the simulations, that maybe this intermediate area, the bit which we know the layering stopped, but we know that we haven't got to the bulk yet. well, maybe what's happening is that the electric field, which of course is not so strong at that point anymore because it's been shielded by the bits in between, maybe it's got enough oomph to be able to rotate the ions, even though it hasn't got enough oomph to be able to make them be in layers anymore. And maybe that rotation leads to something which then is why we can see forces, for instance. And that idea has come about from looking at the molecular dynamics simulations. And now we've got to try and think, is there a way that we can think of directly measuring that? At the moment, we can't think of how we're going to directly measure that, but we'll keep thinking.
Yeah, it sounds quite exciting to look at this kind of area and to try and figure out. It's almost like, it just sounds like a really cool problem to be able to solve.
You know, and it's one of the things I always say to the students that, the undergraduate students who are starting to think about, maybe I want to go into research. There's a transition that I think you have to make. And when I meet the undergraduates, which I do all the time, or school students, people tend to like knowing things, and they enjoy knowing things, and that's why they enjoy learning, because they enjoy knowing things. And to be a happy and successful researcher, what you have to enjoy is not knowing things. What you have to like being in the situation where you don't understand what's going on. You have to like being in the situation where you're in a darkened room with and most of the lights are switched. There might be a little candle over there somewhere or a little light over there somewhere, but most of where you are you can't see, because that's if you're going to be asking the difficult questions, that's the situation you're in. And I just immensely enjoy being in. When I see there's something I don't understand, I just say, right, let's go and work on that, because it's fun, and it's nice to be in a situation where you don't have to come up with a solution to a problem, because if you don't come up with that solution, well, that's that process gone. You're trying to find the solution to the problem just because you're trying to find the solution to the problem, and that's really, I find that really enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is one of the exciting aspects I think about learning and probably, I guess, academic life and research. It's the fact that there is stuff that we still don't know, and there's people out there that want to go out in search of the answers, or just want to tackle the problem because there's a problem there. And so with the ionic liquids and the electrodes, how have you started to tackle this problem, I guess?
Well, so my working in the area, it really came about strangely, and often these things do. And so terrible thing to say, I think my most creative moments come when I'm not listening to a lecture. And I think there's something about you're in a space where someone's giving a lecture, and maybe you've started to wander off slightly in your imagination, but because you're in a scientific space, and because there are scientific words being said around that you're not particularly paying attention to, but so your brain's in a scientific frame of mind, but you're daydreaming. And I find on many occasions that's exactly the moment at which I go, and then start scribbling down notes, though it's been triggered by the lecture, but wasn't really about the lecture. And I was in India, and I was in a lecture which was talking about a technique called single molecule fluorescence spectroscopy. And this is where you have the solution so dilute that you're in your spectral volume, in the bit that you're probing, there is literally one molecule of the probe. And so this person was talking about this, and they were talking about measuring viscosity, and there's always been a problem with the ionic liquids, in that you would expect something that's totally ionic to be highly conducting, and they are conducting, but they're not as highly conducting as you would expect from the measured viscosity. And I was sitting there, I just said, well, just supposing actually we're using the wrong value for the viscosity. And maybe the viscosity that, an ion moving through doing conduction is experiencing isn't the same viscosity that a teaspoon when you're stirring it is. And this technique would let us answer this question. Isn't that an interesting idea? And that just kind of faded off because I was at a conference and, But I remembered this lecture and then I came back here and I was talking to my colleague Joshua Edel. I said, I heard about this technique in India where they could do this, this and this. And he just looked at me and said, we do it. I was like, all right then. And so we just started looking at it together. And what happens when you switch, because of course if you're measuring conductivity, you've got an electric field, of course you have, because that's what you're, and so what happens if we switch on the electrode, and do we see a change in viscosity? And the answer is yes, we do. We see lots of other things as well, so it's very complicated, but the basic question as to whether when the field is on, is the ionic liquid in certain regions, distances from the electrode, more viscous than you would predict it to have been just on the basis of knowing the viscosity? Yes is the answer. I don't think it's enough to explain the thing that I was just talking about, but that's neither here nor there, because who cares? It's explaining something else, or it's measuring something else, and so it was just that, literally that's how it came about. And here we are several years later, having done simulations to try and understand what's happening. We've talked at conferences about our results. We haven't published them yet because they are very, very complex. And also I spent the first couple of years not being very convinced I hadn't got it completely wrong. And so needing to, do repeats, see if there's another experiment you can do that's a bit complementary to it and that kind of stuff. And we're doing that at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds really cool, and just the experiments and kind of what you're doing with it sounds very fundamental, and that's quite exciting to hear. So what types of results are you finding from this experiment, and where do you think it will lead in the future?
Well, will it lead? We can see that there are changes in viscosity that we're measuring. We can see that they're happening over length scales, so distances from the electrode, which are much, much greater, orders of magnitude greater than you would expect from your basic theories of screening of electrodes. We also know when we turn the field off, so when we take it back to Earth, that whatever we have done in the ionic liquid, so it suggests we've made some kind of structure, persists for much longer time than you would expect. And so it's, as I say, it suggests some kind of structure forming thing might be happening. But these very long time and length scales, when you then have that idea in your head and you go back through the literature, there are lots of odd results that, somebody said, oh, this is an odd result, and they've noted it in a paper somewhere and nothing. And then you think, oh, hang on, if you had these long length scales, that result's not so odd. If you had the long time scales, that result's now not so odd. And so I think what might happen is that there is something about the ionic, the species that we happen to pick to make an ionic liquid, and having ions at very, very high concentrations because they're pure, when all of our theories of electrolyte solutions, so the things that you as a physicist might have learned, are based on ultra dilute solutions, so very low concentrations of the ions. And so I think that what we'll discover is that the theories that we have around electrolytes, which are all based around dilute solutions, are a subset of electrolyte behavior. And as you go to more concentrated electrolyte solutions, you get another set of behaviors that up until now we haven't observed, because 801 degrees is a bit difficult to observe, and so we haven't really had the opportunity to see what super concentrated solutions of electrolytes are like in electric fields.
That sounds quite exciting that you're now able to observe this, and I think it's quite amazing how far science has come, and now in the present day we get to kind of almost make these new discoveries because of how far we've come and the types of techniques and what we've developed over the years for the experiments and such. I'm curious, how do you pick which ionic liquids that you choose to study in these electrode environments?
So we've stuck to a couple of ionic liquids, and the reasons are actually very practical, I suppose. So the particular ionic liquid that we use the most, we're using it because it's the one that's used the most. And so it is the ionic liquid about which most is understood. And of course, if your phenomenon is something that you really don't understand, do the best you can to study it with something that you do understand as much as possible. And so that's one reason why we have it. But also, I mentioned earlier, Ron, when I was talking about the biomass, about the hydrogen bond basicity of the anion and absorbing water from the air. So what we don't want to do in our experiment is to think that we're doing an experiment on an ionic liquid, when in fact we're doing an experiment on an ionic liquid and 50% water, because it's absorbed it from the air. And so the particular ionic liquid we use is one which is the least problematic in terms of absorbing water. Now, there are lots of other things we can do to protect the experiment from atmospheric water, have sealed cells, but you just want to be careful. And then finally, it's an ionic liquid that you can make extremely pure. And again, we don't want to be doing an experiment, we think, on our ionic liquid, and in fact what we're doing is an experiment on whatever the impurity is that's in the ionic liquid. So the ones that we're using for these experiments, it's the one that we understand the most and over which we have the greatest control, and so therefore it's the safest to use, as it were, in terms of not having it be an oddity of this ionic liquid that we're observing, and rather than a more general effect, because we understand this ionic liquid. But eventually we will go on to do others as we develop a hypothesis for which we have developed now. We do think we have an idea of what's underlying these effects. So if you think, normally you think of a symmetrical ion, so something that's a sphere, and its center of mass and its center of charge is in the same place because it's symmetrical. But one of the things that we do with our ionic liquid ions in order to make them be ionic liquids is to make them unsymmetrical. And so if you now think about what the electric field is operating on, it's operating on the center of charge. The electric field doesn't care where the center of mass is. It cares where the center of charge is, and because that's what it's interacting with. Well, so the electrode will pull that center of charge towards itself or push it away from itself, depending on whether it's the opposite or same charge. But if the center of mass is no longer coincident with the center of charge and it's somewhere else, the movement of the center of charge doesn't necessarily mean a movement of the center of mass. And so if you think about what that means for a molecule, that means maybe a rotation of the molecule, or it means perhaps an elongation of the molecule or something like that. And so these inter-ionic, so inside the ion effects, could well be at least contributing or causing what we're seeing. And so we've now got a hypothesis. So what we can do is we can say, right, now let's now deliberately pick a very symmetrical ion where that can't happen. Let's now pick an ion where the center of charge and the center of mass are in very different places. Let's pick an ion where, although the center of charge and center of mass are well separated, they're fixed. The ion can't change its configuration to change. Now let's pick something that, although they're well separated, that the ion can change its configuration and bring them together or take them apart. And so you then, once you've got a hypothesis, you can test it. It just at first we didn't have a hypothesis. We just said there's something funny going on, and so let's just throw observations at it. So you go through an observational phase where you just look and think something's happening. Okay, what's happening? Can we build a hypothesis out of the observations, and then can we then do a proper hypothesis-driven experiment?
Yeah, that sounds, well, it's quite interesting to hear the kind of process that you went through to kind of get the fundamentals and then get a hypothesis, and then you're going on to further testing. It just sounds quite exciting. I don't know, I just find it quite fascinating as well to hear about the scientific process, because I think it is quite interesting to hear about where these ideas can kind of come from, and then where they can lead and how you get results from them. So yeah, my brain's kind of churning.
So one of the things, and I do remember being told this when I was a student by one of the professors back at Sussex, him saying, "Oh, you young people, you're always worried that you're going to run out of ideas." And just, that's not the problem. The problem is deciding which ideas you're going to work on. And he was absolutely right. In all sorts of situations, in another situation, that lecture I wouldn't have gone to, or I'd been listening to properly and not been imagining, or something had happened in the next lecture which would have, made me forget that randomness of that bit you can't control. But then oh gosh, and I've got a colleague who we can do experiment, if I didn't have a colleague that I could, it would just be something that I once thought of, and so that part of it. But then also the thought process of, okay, what can I think if you're a scientist, you understand how much imagination is necessary to be a scientist. But I think if you're not a scientist, you imagine that we're just spending our time on spreadsheets in some kind of way, but the imagination creation part of science is the bit that is, for me, most exciting, and it's the bit that the wider population don't even know we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I do absolutely agree with you, because I think, especially just having friends who don't do science at an undergraduate level, it does seem maybe very logical and very unimaginative. You just kind of go through maybe solving a problem or solving an equation or something. But yeah, it does need a very high imagination to think of the problems and then think of how you would go about finding the solution. And it does make science very, I guess, interesting and exciting to study that way. And is that what you find most interesting about studying chemistry? What is your kind of favourite thing about looking into ionic liquids, I guess?
Well, I think, so I have a very pictorial understanding of chemistry as well. And so I have a constantly playing video in my head of the ions in the ionic liquid, how they're interacting with each other, how they're moving around each other. So I have this video in my head that the experiments refine and correct, and so that developing picture is what I enjoy thinking about. So my best friend's an actor who is just writing his own piece that he's taking to the Edinburgh Festival in a couple of weeks' time. And on one level you think, what on earth would an actor and a chemist have in common? Well, actually, it's creativity. That's what we've got in common, amongst other things. But yeah, that act of creative imagination and thinking, well, supposing, that video in my head, supposing it did this instead of that, what would that mean for all of the rest of it? And supposing something came in and it had to rearrange itself, or supposing there was a force on it, and just that, imagining that, and then of course taking that imagination and turning it into, right, okay, so if I wanted to show that it was doing that, what experiment would I have to do to demonstrate that? Oh, I need to do an infrared or a, whatever it is, and then so taking that thing that you've imagined and testing what it is that you've just done, that is just immensely satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does sound like you're extremely interested in, you think you like, well, from where we've been discussing about it, you've got all these questions, and you sound very passionate about your research area, and it's lovely to see, really.
Well, it's just as well. I've been doing it since 1985. If I wasn't passionate about it, God, I'd be bored. Frankly. And genuinely, I mean, it's easy to complain about all the funding system of this and the pressures on us that but we really do get to choose what we work on, and we really do get to follow our ideas, and we really do get to build our passions. It helps if it turns out that the thing you're interested in is useful to someone, but it doesn't always have to be the case. And so we as academic scientists are immensely privileged in being able to just do that. And so sometimes there might be periods in my career where there's been a bulk of work that I've been doing because that's what could get funded, and that's and of course I was interested in it, otherwise I wouldn't have ever proposed it, but it wasn't that super satisfying stuff of the imagination. But there was always an opportunity to get that student to do those experiments while they're at it, and push that little idea forward, and find a way of constantly be working on updating the video.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's quite the flexibility in being able to choose which types of problems researchers work on. It's been something that's been brought up quite a bit when I've been talking to various researchers about their favourite thing about being a researcher, and I think that quite a few of them really enjoy that aspect and the freedom it gives them to be able to work on these problems. They, as you said, like, there are always things to complain about, but that is something that crops up. They're like, well, it's a privilege to be able to work on the problem that I really enjoy, and to have the freedom to be able to just think about it as like your day job. It just sounds amazing. And would you say that's also your favourite thing about being a researcher?
Yeah, so yes, in terms of the work itself. I mean, my other favourite thing is, I love the people I work with. My research group, it's a joy to be with them. As a teacher, actually, I enjoy. My favourite teaching task is demonstrating in a laboratory. Just spending an afternoon wandering around, chatting to people, and saying, "Oh, that's not quite the colour I was expecting. What are you doing here?" And getting to know them while we're exploring whatever it is that experiment's exploring. And so just spending time with, I'm going to say the word young. Spending time with young people is, that's also an immense privilege, especially the kind of young people that we have here at Imperial College. Yeah, so there's that element of it as well. There's the stuff about the work that I love, but I love working with the young people that I'm working with. Well, and also some of my contemporaries as well that I'm collaborating with, of course. But yeah, just being with other people who are excited about what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's well, as a young person, it is quite nice to hear that from professors, that the fact that they really enjoy teaching and being around young people and kind of almost teaching their knowledge and then
there's a definition of a professor that I heard when I was just starting out that I really quite like. That a professor is a person that a student will pass on to their successor student in order to keep the professor abreast of modern developments. And the idea, and it is absolutely true, isn't it? Of course, it's not that I walk into the room and everybody falls into silence and learns from my, fabulous knowledge and wisdom. It's a relationship, and I'm constantly learning from them as well as them learning from me. Both actually about, when I was a student, in order to, look up a paper in the literature, you had to go into a room that was full of books and sit down for 2 days and, not, get your phone out and zip, and suddenly it's all there in front of you. So, keeping me abreast of those developments, it's turned out to be a role that my students have played. But, just ways of looking at things and it's an immense privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of that leads quite perfectly onto another question I would like to ask you. In what kind of advice do you have for current undergraduates, maybe if they're looking into research, or maybe they don't quite know what they want to do yet, but they're just studying a science?
So first of all, I would say don't worry about not quite knowing what you want to do. I've never quite known what I want to do, and yet I've always done something that I'm enjoying doing. The basis of choice, I think, should be that. So don't worry about money, don't worry about prestige, don't worry about state, don't worry about any of that kind of stuff, because people of your talents, people of the talent that students that graduate from Imperial College will have success in whatever they choose to do. If they, whether it's, investment banking, whether it's research, whether it's, going to work for a charity, whatever they choose to do, they have everything which is necessary to be successful at that. So don't worry about that, because that bit's going to happen. What is sad to see is people who didn't choose deliberately the thing that they thought that they would enjoy most. And you see people go down these tracks of, hunting out something that doesn't matter. And the only sensible choice is to choose the thing that you think will make you happy. And I think if you do that, you end up happy. It's just, and also, another way of thinking of it, so as your parents were holding you as a baby in their arms, the thing that they wanted for you was for you to be happy. And follow their advice, and pick what you think will make you happy, and then chances are it will. So that's important advice. If it's research that you think will make you happy, do understand it is a challenge. When you're embarking upon wanting to do world-leading research, wanting to do research that's never been done before. When you're embarking upon that task, you have just said the intellectual equivalent of someone saying, I want to be an Olympic athlete. It's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. You are expected to go and, run in the rain. You are expected to, have injuries. You are that is part of the decision. But if it is truly what you love and enjoy, then of course you accept that in order to get what you want to have, which is to be the first person to know something. And that takes commitment, it takes hard work, it takes talent, it takes luck, it takes all sorts of things. It is not easy, but it is immensely satisfying.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing advice, and absolutely so correct. Obviously, I think especially with the do what makes you happy, that's one thing that I completely agree with, because it's my parents' advice as well. From growing up and stuff, my parents have always been like, just do what makes you happy. No matter what it is, everything else will work itself out, as you say. And with the research, I think it's a fantastic comparison to compare it to an Olympic athlete, and it probably puts it into a bit more perspective. And you sound very wise. There's very wise advice.
On the other hand, some people think he talks rubbish. but it's what I believe. It's what I believe, and it's worked for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thank you for the advice. And I think that brings us to the very final question of the podcast. And do you have any book or article that you would like to recommend to us?
Absolutely, I do. And so the book is Solvents and Solvent Effects by Christian Reichhardt. And back in the 1990s, when I was working in ionic liquids and I would go to conferences and I'd think, I was an inorganic chemist, and I'd be sitting there thinking, why doesn't one of the organic chemists do the experiments around solvent effects on organic chemistry, which is a known thing on organic reactions? And I'd sit there and think, why is one? And then of course it dawned on me, why don't you do it, Tom? Except of course I'd just had a couple of lectures as an undergraduate on it and I knew nothing about it. And then I came across Christian's book, and it's just amazing. The sheer amount of information that it has in it is just remarkable. And so I started ploughing my way through it. I started teaching myself about how you measure the effects of a solvent on the rate of a reaction, is what I particularly did, and it all came from Christian's book. And that became really the bit of ionic liquids that within the field I first got to be famous for, and so it led to a real advance in my career. And and then I got to meet Christian, and he is the nicest person you could ever wish to meet. He's long since retired. In fact, I think he was retired then, and and still occasionally I'll get literally a printed paper in the post from him saying, I've seen this paper, I thought you might find it. He's such a lovely, lovely man. And then in full cycle, on the last edition of the book, the commissioning editor, who I'd met, I knew Elke, and I told her that the book was so important to me, I didn't let it out of my office because I was so frightened of losing it that people could come in and read it, but they had to sit in my office to read it. And I told her that story. And she came to me and she said, we're looking for a co-author with Christian for the latest edition, and I remembered what you told me about the book, and I thought you might like to be the co-author with him. And so now I am. And isn't that lovely?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic recommendation and a brilliant story to go along with it. And so it's quite beautiful that it's come full circle as well. Yeah. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for being on this podcast.
No, thank you.
Brilliant.
It's a pleasure.
So thank you for listening to this week's episode of Delving into Academics, and I hope you found it interesting. Please like, review, comment and subscribe wherever you're listening to this. And if you want to find out more about the researcher, I will have their university website page linked in the description. See you in 2 weeks for another episode.